On a wet Tuesday morning in April 1978, in Jasper County, Iowa, 71-year-old Earl Mercer stood beside a sagging red barn while a white delivery van backed through the mud. The driver opened the rear doors and tipped 12 burlap sacks onto the ground. Coffee grounds spilled out, dark and steaming in the cold air. Earl watched without moving. For 10 years, the Maple Street Coffee House had called those grounds garbage. Earl called them feedstock. His neighbor, his banker, and nearly everyone who drove past his farm called them worse. By noon, Earl had 3 tons of coffee waste piled behind the barn, 1 worn-out tractor, and a business nobody believed could survive. The tractor was a 1948 Farmall M. Earl had bought it used in 1961 for $1,250 after his father died and left him 80 acres, a red tin toolbox, and a ledger full of debts. The Farmall had 4 cylinders, about 36 belt horsepower, and enough iron in its frame to make 2 younger machines look like toys. Earl had rebuilt its engine twice, replaced the clutch once, and painted nothing except the numbers. He said paint was for machinery that needed attention. The Farmall did not. That morning, Earl climbed onto its seat, wiped rain from the steering wheel, and looked toward the coffee sacks. His wife, Ruth, had been gone 3 years. His children lived in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. His farm was losing money. And the coffee shop had just delivered the raw material for the strangest idea Earl had ever had. The idea had started with worms. Not fishing worms. Red wigglers. In September 1968, Earl had attended a county soil meeting because his corn was producing poorly on a field that had once been his best. A young extension agent talked about compost, organic matter, and the millions of organisms living in healthy soil. Most farmers listened politely. Earl listened with both hands folded over his cane. Afterward, the agent mentioned that earthworms could turn organic waste into a dark, stable material called vermicompost. Earl went home and dug. He found worms under an old manure pile. He built a wooden box from discarded boards. Then he added leaves, straw, kitchen scraps, and coffee grounds. The worms multiplied. So did the questions. Let me tell you about Earl Mercer. He was not a scientist. He had no college degree. He had never written a business plan. His fingernails were permanently dark from soil, and the cuffs of his blue work shirts were polished smooth from decades of washing. He measured time by planting and harvest, not calendars. When he spoke, people sometimes waited because they thought he had not finished. He usually had. By 1972, Earl was giving compost to neighbors for their vegetable gardens. By 1975, 2 greenhouse growers near Newton were buying small quantities. Earl charged $3 for a 50-pound bag, then $4.50, and kept handwritten notes in Ruth's old recipe book. The coffee shop noticed. Every Friday, its manager, a young man named Daniel Price, sent a pickup load of used grounds to Earl's farm. Daniel was 29, wore clean work boots, drove a new Ford F-150, and had recently expanded the coffee house into a second location. He liked efficiency. He liked numbers. He liked things that could be measured. Earl's worm beds did not look measurable. They looked like piles of wet bedding under crooked boards. Daniel laughed the first time he saw them. Earl only said, "They don't need to look rich. They need to make soil rich." Daniel shrugged. 4 years, the arrangement continued. Coffee grounds arrived. Earl mixed them with shredded leaves, aged manure, straw, and cardboard. The Farmall M pulled a small manure spreader through the yard. Earl checked moisture by squeezing handfuls. Too wet, he added dry bedding. Too dry, he watered slowly. He kept the beds shaded with old roofing panels. The worms did the rest. By 1977, Earl had nearly 200 beds. Then the bank came. The drought had been hard. Fertilizer prices were rising. Earl's corn yield had fallen, and the mortgage payment was due in October. His banker, 38-year-old Calvin Reed, arrived in a tan Chevrolet Caprice with polished shoes and a folder under his arm. Calvin was successful. He had an accounting degree from the University of Iowa, a new house in town, and a reputation for saving troubled farm loans by forcing hard decisions. He walked through Earl's barn and stared at the coffee grounds. "You're borrowing money to haul this in?" Calvin asked. "No." "You're selling it?" "Yes." "How much?" "Enough." Calvin smiled. That was the first mistake. A week later, Calvin returned with 2 bank employees and Daniel Price. Earl had just finished loading compost into a borrowed flatbed. Daniel pointed toward the worm beds. "You really think people are going to pay for this?" Earl kept tightening a chain. Daniel laughed. It was not a cruel laugh at first. It was the laugh of a young man who believed the answer was obvious. Then one bank employee joined him. Calvin smiled. The sound carried across the barnyard. Earl looked up. His face did not change. He wiped his hands on his overalls and said, "People already pay for fertilizer. I'm just making mine from what they throw away." Nobody answered. Calvin closed his folder. The bank gave Earl 90 days. That was the part people missed. Earl had not discovered a miracle. He had discovered a process. The grounds arrived free, the worms did the conversion, and the farmer supplied patience, shade, moisture, labor, and judgment. None of those things looked impressive alone. Together, they became a business. He kept no spreadsheets. He kept lists in pencil, beside grocery notes and seed orders. Somehow, those pages told him more than a computer could have. 90 days to prove the worms could pay the mortgage. And Earl had just found out the coffee shop was about to stop bringing him grounds. The notice arrived on a Monday in January 1978. Maple Street Coffee House was changing its waste contract. A commercial hauler would collect the grounds. Earl could no longer have them. For most people, it would have been good news. For Earl, it was a blow. The coffee grounds were not the whole business, but they were the balance point. They supplied nitrogen. They heated the compost pile. They gave the worms a steady food source during winter when fresh plant material was scarce. Earl stood in the kitchen that night, reading Daniel's letter under the yellow light above the sink. Ruth's recipe book lay open beside him. On one page was a handwritten note from 1974, "Bed 17 too wet. Add straw." Earl folded the letter. Then he called Calvin. "I'm still paying the loan." Calvin sighed. "You have 90 days. I know. You need a buyer. I know. You need more than neighbors buying garden bags. I know." Calvin paused. "Earl, what are you actually trying to build?" Earl looked through the window toward the dark barn. "A soil business." Calvin said nothing. Earl added, "Not a worm business." That distinction mattered. "Let me tell you about the Farmall M." The tractor had spent almost 30 years doing ordinary work. It had pulled a 2-bottom plow, dragged a disc harrow, hauled hay, and turned the belt pulley on an old hammer mill. Earl's father had bought it used from a farmer near Independence, Iowa, in October 1961. The seller wanted $1,400. Earl had $1,250 in cash. They shook hands. The Farmall came home smoking. Earl rebuilt it in the barn. He installed new rings, cleaned the carburetor, replaced 2 valves, and learned something he never forgot: a machine does not have to be pretty to be dependable. That winter, the tractor became the heart of Earl's new operation. He used the Farmall to pull a homemade screening rig built from angle iron and hardware cloth. The rig shook compost through a fine mesh while larger pieces rolled away. It was slow. It was loud. It was almost entirely manual. But it worked. Earl began calling greenhouse owners. Most said no. One said, "We don't buy dirt from farmers." Earl replied, "Good. I don't sell dirt." He hung up. 3 days later, the man called back. He wanted 20 bags. The first serious order came from a nursery outside Iowa City. 250 bags. At $4.75 each. Earl wrote the number in Ruth's recipe book. $1,187.50. It was not enough to save the farm. But it was proof. Calvin visited again. This time, he did not laugh. He watched Earl test the compost by hand. Earl explained that mature vermicompost should smell earthy, not sour. He showed him finished material that crumbled like coffee grounds. He showed Calvin worms retreating from fresh waste and gathering where the material had cooled. Calvin picked up a handful. "That's all from coffee." "Not all." "What else?" "Leaves, straw, manure, cardboard, and worms." Earl nodded. Calvin looked across the barn. There were hundreds of beds. Maybe thousands of worms. Then the extension office called. A greenhouse grower in Illinois wanted to test Earl's compost on tomato seedlings. The order was large. Too large. Earl did not have enough screened material. He had 5 weeks. So he worked. At 5 each morning, the Farmall started with 3 coughs, a metallic rattle, and a cloud of blue smoke. Earl would let the engine idle before pulling the choke. He believed cold engines should be given time to remember themselves. By sunrise, he was moving compost. By noon, he was screening. By evening, he was filling bags. His hands cracked. His boots soaked through. His back hurt. But the beds kept moving. The worms never knew the difference between fertilizer and yesterday's trash. They responded to what Earl gave them, and Earl learned to listen. Winter tested him hardest. Coffee grounds arrived warm, but frozen bedding could stop a bed cold. Earl learned to cover the piles with old hay and leave air gaps beneath the roofing sheets. He checked the beds before breakfast, touching the surface with 2 fingers. If the material felt cool and damp, he left it alone. If it felt hot, he turned it. He kept a thermometer hanging from a nail, but he trusted his hands first. The Farmall helped with that work, though Earl used it gently. He never raced the engine. He selected a low gear, eased out the clutch, and let the tractor's weight do the pulling. He believed machinery lasted longest when a man stopped asking it to prove something. Then, in March, Daniel Price drove onto the farm. He had a new problem. The commercial waste hauler wanted to charge Maple Street Coffee House for every load of grounds. Daniel looked at Earl. "You still want them?" Earl nodded. Daniel smiled. "All of them. All of them." Daniel looked toward the barn. "You know, Earl, there are probably 4 tons a month." Earl leaned against the Farmall. "Then bring 4. Daniel laughed softly this time. Not at him. With him. But the biggest test had not arrived. The Illinois greenhouse sent the test results. Tomato growth was up. Root mass was stronger. The grower wanted a contract. Earl needed equipment to fulfill it. The bank needed proof before lending him another $1. And Calvin Reed had 90 days to decide whether a farm full of worms was a business or a very expensive mistake. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Maybe it was an old machine. Maybe it was a skill nobody respected. Maybe it was an idea that made sense only after you had spent years learning why it worked. Earl had spent 10 years listening to laughter. Now the clock was running. On April 14, 1978, Calvin arrived with the loan papers, and Earl opened the barn door to show him something that had been growing in the dark. Inside the barn, the air smelled of earth, coffee, straw, and rain. Calvin stepped carefully between the beds. Earl pointed to the newest pile. "This one is ready." Calvin crouched. He picked up a handful. The material was dark brown and loose. No coffee smell. No manure smell. Just soil. "How much can you make?" Calvin asked. Earl looked at the rows. "About 300 bags a week." Calvin calculated. "That's 15,000 bags a year. If I can keep the orders." "You have 1 contract." 2. Calvin looked up. 2. Earl handed him a letter. A nursery in Wisconsin wanted 500 bags. The second letter was from the Illinois greenhouse. Calvin read both. His expression changed. For the first time, he saw the farm not as a failing corn operation, but as a small manufacturing plant disguised as a barnyard. The bank approved a $6,000 equipment loan. Earl bought a used electric screen and a second-hand bagging machine. The Farmall M remained. It pulled. It hauled. It did not care that the business model had changed. By June 1978, trucks were coming from 3 states: Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin. The coffee grounds that once went into dumpsters were now part of a product sold by the pallet. Earl called it Black Gold Compost. He never trademarked the name. He thought trademarks were for companies with lawyers. He had a Farmall. That was enough. A farm needed usefulness, not appearances. The first shipment to Illinois nearly failed. A storm turned the access road into mud. The truck carrying Earl's bags arrived 2 hours early and immediately sank near the loading shed. The driver tried to back out. The rear wheels spun. Earl watched. Calvin arrived just as the driver was climbing from the cab. "Call a tow truck," Calvin said. Earl shook his head. He walked to the Farmall. The tractor had been sitting under the shed, dry and warm. Earl checked the hitch, then the chain, then the ground. He climbed aboard. The engine caught on the second try. The chain tightened. The truck's tires turned. Mud rose around the wheels. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the truck moved backward 6 inches. Another 6. Then a foot. The driver stared. Calvin smiled. Earl never looked back. He parked the tractor and returned to the bags. That little rescue became one of the stories people repeated later, because it captured the farm better than any sales figure. The machine was old. The road was bad. The load was heavy. Nobody asked whether the tractor looked modern. They asked whether it could pull. It could. And Earl knew exactly how to make it. Then came the county fair. Earl had been invited to display his compost in the agricultural building. Calvin attended. Daniel attended. So did farmers who had laughed at the worm beds. Earl stacked 50-pound bags beside a wooden sign. Black Gold Compost. Made from local organic waste. A man from the county board asked how much he sold. Earl answered. The man whistled. Then Daniel looked at the old Farmall parked outside. "You know," he said, "that tractor is probably worth more than the whole operation was when you started." Earl smiled. "Probably." Then the crowd grew quiet. A regional farm equipment dealer had arrived. He was carrying a brochure for a new tractor. It had more horsepower, hydraulic power, and modern controls. He looked at the Farmall. 40 years old, he said. 30. Still looks older. Earl said nothing. The dealer grinned. "Wouldn't you rather have something modern?" Earl looked at the tractor. "No." The dealer laughed. This time, Calvin did not. He had learned. The technical truth was simple. Horsepower tells you how fast work can be done. Torque tells you how hard the engine can pull at a given speed. An old Farmall M made roughly 36 belt horsepower, but its usefulness came from the way that power arrived through simple gearing and a heavy drivetrain. In low gear, the tractor could turn slowly and pull hard. That mattered on a farm. It meant a machine could spend an hour doing one difficult job without pretending it was a race. Modern machines could do more. But more was not always the same as better. For Earl, the Farmall's value was also measured in memory. Every scratch had a story. Every repair meant someone had cared enough to keep going. By August 1978, Earl had sold more than 18,000 bags. Gross sales passed $90,000. His mortgage was current. The bank loan was ahead of schedule. And Maple Street Coffee House was now paying Earl to take its grounds. Daniel came every Friday. He no longer wore the expression of a man visiting a strange farm. He came with invoices. One afternoon, he found Earl repairing a loose bolt on the screening rig. Daniel said, "I owe you an apology." Earl kept working. "For laughing. For thinking I knew what value looked like." Earl tightened the bolt. Then he said, "Most people do." Daniel looked toward the beds. "What changed your mind?" Earl finally looked at him. "The numbers." Daniel laughed. Earl smiled. That fall, Calvin Reed closed Earl's old loan file. He wrote one sentence on the final page. Borrower was underestimated. Years later, Calvin would tell people that line was the most accurate thing he had ever written in a bank. But there was one more thing. A national garden supplier had heard about Earl's compost. They wanted 20,000 bags per month. The order was so large that Earl could not fill it. He had one farm, one Farmall, and a business built around worms that had started in a wooden box. The supplier gave him 30 days to answer. Earl stared at the contract. Then he walked outside. The Farmall M sat under the cottonwood tree. He put his hand on its hood. And for the first time in 10 years, Earl admitted he might need help. Help came from an unexpected place. Calvin Reed arrived on a Saturday morning in October 1978. He parked beside the barn and walked toward Earl carrying a thermos. "You called me," Calvin said. "I did. You need another loan?" "No." "What do you need?" Earl pointed toward the compost beds. "People." So Calvin helped him organize. Not as a banker. As a neighbor. They brought in 4 local workers, 2 retired farmers, and Daniel's younger brother. The coffee shop expanded its collection route. Local restaurants joined. A grocery store began sending vegetable trimmings. The farm's waste stream became a network. Earl refused to call it expansion. He called it sharing the work. By spring 1979, Black Gold Compost was shipping across 5 states. The national supplier signed a smaller contract first. 10,000 bags a month. Earl's annual sales crossed $400,000. But he did not buy a new tractor. He rebuilt the Farmall again. The engine was tired. The rear tires were cracked. The hydraulic system leaked. Earl spent $1,800 restoring it. When Calvin asked why he did not replace it, Earl answered, "Because this one knows the farm." Let me tell you about what happened after the newspaper stories faded. Success came quietly. There was no mansion. No private airplane. Earl bought a new roof for the barn. He paid off the mortgage. He put money aside for his grandchildren. Then he planted another 20 acres in hay. By 1983, 5 years after the bank crisis, the farm was being managed by Earl's daughter, Mary, who had moved home from Cedar Rapids. She modernized the bookkeeping but kept the old beds. The Farmall still pulled the oldest spreader. Daniel Price had opened 3 more coffee shops. Every location sent grounds to Earl's operation. He became the man who could turn yesterday's waste into tomorrow's soil. Calvin stayed at the bank. But his approach changed. He asked questions. Then he listened. He kept a photograph of Earl's Farmall M on his desk. On the back, he had written the date. October 14, 1978. The day he learned that an asset was not always something that looked valuable on paper. Earl died peacefully in May 1989 at the age of 82. His hands had become thin. His boots were still beside the back door. Mary found the old recipe book in his kitchen. Inside were years of notes. Bed temperatures. Moisture levels. Orders. Prices. Names. And on one page, written in Ruth's handwriting, was the first sentence about the worms. "Try this before giving up." Mary kept the page. She kept the farm. She kept the business. And she kept the Farmall. 10 years after Earl's death, the tractor was still running. It had a new paint job by then. Mary had resisted painting it until the engine was rebuilt. When it finally returned from the shop, she parked it beside the barn. The same barn where the first coffee grounds had been dumped. The same yard where Daniel had laughed. The same place where Calvin had once come to collect a debt. In 1999, Calvin retired. At his retirement dinner, someone asked what loan he remembered most. He did not mention a large developer. He did not mention a factory. He talked about Earl Mercer. He said, "I thought I was protecting the bank from a farmer who didn't understand business. I eventually realized I was protecting my own assumptions from a farmer who understood value better than I did." Then he laughed. Not the old laugh. A grateful one. Daniel kept sending coffee grounds to the farm until he sold his final cafe in 2004. By then, the relationship had lasted more than 30 years. The coffee grounds were still coming. The worms were still working. And the Farmall was still pulling. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room said you were wrong? If you have, you understand Earl better than any number can explain him. Because Earl never won by shouting. He won by continuing. The coffee shop saw grounds. Earl saw nitrogen. The banker saw a failing farm. Earl saw a production system. The young men saw an old tractor. Earl saw a machine that had already proven itself. 5 years became 10. 10 became 20. And the farm kept changing without losing its center. In 2008, Mary gave the Farmall M to her son, Thomas. He used it for demonstrations at local schools. Children climbed onto the seat. Adults asked about horsepower. Thomas told them about Earl. Then he showed them the original wooden worm box. It was still in the barn. The boards were dark with age. One corner had been repaired with a piece of oak. It was not worth anything at auction. But nobody in that family would sell it. They are valuable because they remember what happened when someone refused to quit. And behind the old barn, the Farmall M still started on cold mornings. It coughed. It rattled. Then it settled into its steady rhythm. The same rhythm Earl had heard before sunrise for nearly 3 decades. The same rhythm Mary remembered from childhood. The same rhythm Thomas heard when he turned the key. There are machines that become obsolete. There are machines that become antiques. And there are machines that become family. Earl's Farmall became all three. If you knew someone like Earl, someone who kept an old machine running, or found value in what others threw away, tell me their story in the comments. I read every one, because the best farm stories often never made a newspaper. And if you want another story about a farmer who kept an impossible machine alive when the bank wanted it gone, that story is waiting in the next field over, where an old case tractor disappeared for 11 years and came back running. Some things do not become obsolete. They simply wait for someone patient enough to remember what they were built to do.